I woke the morning that changed everything with that familiar ache in my chest, the kind that had become so normal. I almost stopped noticing it, but something about that day felt heavier, like the air itself knew before I did that my body was running out of time, and as I moved slowly through the kitchen, each small task felt like lifting stones, and I kept telling myself it was only age, only weariness, only the lingering traces of the illness I'd been wrestling for months. But the truth was pushing from beneath my ribs, sharp and insistent, and I didn't want to face it. Not yet, not alone, and I told myself I would call my grandson later, after he returned from work, because he always came when I asked, always checked on me, always made time, no matter how busy his life grew. But for the last year, something had shifted around him, a distance I didn't understand, a tension I couldn't name, and each time I saw him, that bright light he carried, since childhood flickered smaller, as though someone had pressed their hands around it and squeezed, and I tried not to think about the reason, tried not to name it, tried not to admit that ever since he married her, the air around him felt different, heavier, colder, as if the warmth he used to move through the world with had been wrapped in careful layers of someone else's wants and expectations. And that morning, as I sat at the table, breath catching in thin stitches, I knew I needed to tell him something important, something I had held inside for too long, something about the future that was coming faster than any of us wanted to believe. And I picked up my phone, hands trembling more from fear than age, and dialed, hoping to hear his voice. But the call went unanswered, and I tried again, because he always picked up, eventually, always called back, always made space. But this time, the silence stretched long enough to make my chest tighten, and I told myself, he must be busy, he must be driving, he must to be helping someone. He must be somewhere where he couldn't hear the phone. But doubt slipped in like cold water down my spine, because lately his calls came later, his messages shorter, his visits rushed, and each time she was with him, something inside him seemed to fold into itself, shrinking just a little more. And I hadn't wanted to believe she was the cause, hadn't wanted to accuse, hadn't wanted to see what was right in front of me. But her smile never reached. Her eyes and her voice always carried that thin note of impatience when I spoke, and whenever I needed help, she had a reason why he couldn't come, why he was too busy, why I shouldn't bother him. And I never wanted to think badly of her. I tried to give her the same grace I gave all young people trying to build a life. But there were moments, little ones, small cracks that revealed something colder beneath her charm, the way she rolled her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she sighed when my grandson offered to visit me, the way she muttered under her breath about old people being dramatic or needy or selfish, and I had swallowed those moments for the sake of peace, telling myself I was imagining it, telling myself I was being unfair, telling myself love sometimes makes the young careless. But that morning when I called again and still heard nothing, I felt a fear deeper than illness, deeper than loneliness, fear that maybe she had pulled him far enough away that he could no longer hear me, and the pain in my chest grew sharper each minute until the room felt dim around the edges. And I reached for the counter to steady myself, but my knees faltered, and I lowered myself slowly into the chair, breathing in shallow, trembling gulps. And I knew then something was wrong, truly wrong inside my body, something that could not wait. And I whispered his name into the empty room, hoping somehow he would feel it, hoping the bond we carried all these years still meant something, hoping I was not as alone as the walls made me feel. And I reached for the phone again, dialing with shaking fingers, and this time the call connected on the second ring, but it wasn't him who answered it. It was her, her voice bright, too bright, sharp around the edges, as if she were annoyed I had interrupted something. And when I asked for him, she let out a sigh, a long one meant to make me feel like a burden, and said he was busy, said he was getting ready, said they had plans, said today wasn't a good day. And I tried to explain I wasn't feeling right, that I needed to speak with him, that I needed him to come by if he could, but she cut me off quickly, saying he didn't have time, saying I shouldn't make him worry, saying I was probably just tired, saying I needed rest. And I could hear music in the background, loud and pulsing voices laughing, glasses clinking, her breath slightly breathless, as though they was walking around, preparing for something. And the realization hit me they were going out, and she didn't want him to know I needed him. She didn't want him to leave. She didn't want him to choose me. She didn't want anything interrupting whatever plans she had made. And when I said again that something felt wrong, she let her voice drop into that cold tone, she thought. Sounded gentle, but always carried a blade. And she said I was overreacting, said I should lie down, said if it was really urgent I should call someone else, not him, because he had enough stress in his life already. And before I could answer, she hung up, leaving me alone with the sound of my own heartbeat pounding unevenly inside my chest. And I stared at the phone for a long time, feeling the room tilt slightly around me, and I whispered his name again, barely audible, as if saying it softly would summon him. But nothing answered. Not his voice, not a message, not a knock on the door. And I felt the pain rising sharper, spreading across my left side, and I knew I needed help. I knew I couldn't wait. But I also knew she had spent months, subtly, teaching him not to take my concerns seriously, teaching him to view my needs as interruptions, teaching him that my vulnerability was an inconvenience. And now, with my breath shortening and the edges of the room growing dim, I understood the cost of that distance, because every second felt heavier and colder and more fragile. And I closed my eyes, gripping the table, trying to steady myself, but my body was slipping and the truth was sinking in. I might be fighting for my life alone while she laughed in the background, planning a night out, posting photos, smiling while I struggled to breathe, hoping against hope that my grandson would somehow see through the fog she wrapped around him and remember who he used to be before she taught him not to hear me. The minutes after she hung up felt heavier than the hours that came before, because the silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a verdict, a confirmation that the little space she had been carving between us for years had finally widened into a chasm. And I kept sitting there, gripping the edge, of the table, trying to steady my breath, but every inhale came thinner, every exhale came sharper, and the ache that had been humming in my chest for months now pulsed like a warning bell. And I knew I needed help, real help, not reassurance, not excuses, not a voice telling me to lie down and rest. And I reached for the phone again, fingers shaking harder, this time dialing the one number I had always trusted to answer. But before I could press call, the pain shot through me so abruptly, I had to brace both hands against the table and lean forward. And for a moment my vision blurred, as if someone had dimmed the lights inside my own body, and I whispered his name through clenched teeth, begging the universe to send him before it was too late. But the only sound that answered was the ticking of the clock on the wall, steady, cold, indifferent, and I pushed myself up slowly, holding onto the counter for balance, trying to gather enough strength to reach the door in case I needed to call for help. Outside, but my legs trembled, and the room tilted gently, the edges softening, like my consciousness was being pulled away thread by thread, and I sat back down, hard breath catching in my throat. And I told myself to stay awake, to stay present, to keep breathing, no matter how uneven it became. And finally, with the last steadiness I had, I pressed the emergency 2 number and waited, each ring a dull throb in my chest, until I heard the operator's voice, firm, calm, grounding. And as I tried to speak, the words cracked in my throat, from fear, from pain, from the realization that I was calling for help alone, because the person I loved most had been taught not to hear my voice. And the operator stayed steady, guiding me through questions, helping me stay conscious, telling me help was on the way. And I clung to that voice the way someone clings to a rope in deep water, because everything around me felt like it was sinking and fading. And when I finally moved the phone from my ear, my whole body shook from exertion, and the only thought in my mind was, I hope he finds out. I tried to reach him. I hope he knows I thought of him first. I hope he understands someday. And the sirens arrived, faint at first, then louder, pulling closer, until they stopped outside my door, and I forced myself to stay awake long enough to call out weakly, and the paramedics came in, moving quickly, voices overlapping, calm and urgent at the same time, placing straps, pressing hands, checking vitals, asking questions I couldn't fully answer, and they lifted me onto the stretcher. And as they wheeled me out, the last thing I saw was the small photograph on the hallway shelf, the one of my grandson, as a little boy sitting on my porch, smiling with a light so bright it hurt to remember how much he had changed. And the world tilted again as they loaded me into the ambulance, and one paramedic told me to keep my eyes open, told me I was doing great, told me they were going to take care of me, told me I wasn't alone, and I held on to those words because they were the first ones I had heard all day. That didn't feel like dismissal. And inside the ambulance, the lights blurred, the ceiling swayed, and my chest kept tightening in sharp, uneven pulses, and I tried to stay awake, tried to focus on anything to keep from slipping under, but all I could think about was him, my grandson, the boy who used to run to me, the boy who used to call me just to talk, the boy who once promised he would always be there when I needed him. And the memory brought a different kind of ache, the kind that doesn't attack the body but the heart. And I wondered if he was laughing somewhere, if he was dancing, if he was taking pictures with her, if he was surrounded by music loud enough to drown out every missed call, every message I didn't get to send, every moment he didn't know he was losing. And the thought stung deeper than the pain in my chest, because I knew she wouldn't tell him. I called. She wouldn't tell him I needed help. She wouldn't tell him I told her something was wrong. She would let him party, let him drink, let him take photos, let him post smiles while I fought to stay conscious in the back of an ambulance, and I could almost see her face, that expression she wore whenever she thought I was being dramatic, the way she looked past me, the way she acted, as if my presence was a nuisance she had to endure for the sake of appearances, and the realization that I was right about her all along hit me harder than I expected. But even through the pain, I didn't resent my grandson, because I knew none of this was born from cruelty. He had a soft, trusting heart, one that always wanted to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it, and she had learned how to bend that softness until it shaped itself to her needs. And now, lying in the ambulance, darkness creeping around the edges of my vision, I whispered his name again, not because he could hear me, but because speaking it made me feel tethered to something real, something warm, something that made the fear settle for a moment. And the paramedic held my wrist, counting the pulse that kept jumping erratically, and I heard him tell the driver to hurry, and the sense of urgency in his voice finally made everything clear. This wasn't exhaustion. This wasn't age. This wasn't something I could sleep through. This was serious. This was life-threatening. This was the moment everything could end. And as the ambulance turned sharply, I felt consciousness slipping like sand between my fingers, and the paramedic squeezed my shoulder, telling me to stay with him, telling me to keep looking at his face, telling me they were almost there. But the world dimmed more with each breath, and the last thing I remember before everything went dark was the image of my grandson's face, when he was young, bright, innocent, full of love, untouched by the distance she later carved between us. And I prayed silently that if something happened to me, he would someday learn the truth, that I had called him, that I had reached for him, that I had wanted him by my side even as my body betrayed me, and that the silence he believed was mine had never belonged to me. It belonged to her. When I woke again, everything felt different, the way the world feels after a long fever, where you surface slowly, unsure if the room around you is real or memory. And the ceiling above me was unfamiliar, bright, sterile, humming with the cold, steady sound of hospital machines, and for a moment I couldn't remember how I got there, couldn't remember the phone call, the ambulance, the panic. Then the pain returned in faint echoes, and I realized I was still here, still alive, still fighting. And a nurse leaned over me, speaking gently, telling me I had scared them, telling me I had arrived just in time, telling me they needed to monitor me closely because my heart had struggled through the night. And I nodded, trying to process the pieces of what had happened. But my first thought wasn't about the danger or the fear. It was about him, whether he knew, whether he had been told, whether she had let him hear the message that I needed him. And the nurse asked if there was someone she should call, someone who needed to know. I was here, and I whispered his name, the only name that mattered, the one person I wanted beside me, and she wrote it down, assuring me she would reach out. And I waited, lying there, staring at the strange ceiling, listening to the mechanical rhythm of the monitor, each beep, a reminder that my heart hadn't given up. But every minute that passed without hearing his voice felt heavier, and I imagined him at home or at work, or maybe still asleep, scrolling on his phone, unaware that while he was living the quiet morning I has been fighting for breath, praying the ambulance would arrive in time. And I imagined her beside him, even more vividly imagined her glare, the way her voice might rise in annoyance if she heard my name, the way she might tell him I was fine, tell him I was being dramatic, tell him not to let my needs interrupt their plans again. And that thought alone made my stomach twist, not because I feared her, but because I feared the power she had slowly gained over him without him noticing. and the nurse returned after a while saying she left a message, saying she called twice, saying no one answered, and the air in the room felt colder suddenly, heavier, pressing down against my ribs, because I knew if the call, he went to him. He would come. He had always come. He had never ignored me, not once, not until she began, filtering everything through her own moods and preferences, and even though the nurse didn't say it out loud, I could hear her thinking, what kind of family doesn't answer at a time like this? And I wanted to tell her he wasn't heartless. He wasn't neglectful, he wasn't uncaring, he was lost, blinded by, someone who never wanted to share his attention with anyone else. And I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion pull me down. But I kept drifting in and out, waking to the same empty room, the same steady beeping, the same ache in my chest, and each time I woke I expected him to be there, sitting by the bed, holding my hand like he used to when he was younger, after I fell or got sick, but the chair beside me stayed untouched, and my heart kept sinking lower and lower beneath the weight of that absence. And hours passed, maybe more, maybe less. I couldn't tell, but the hallway outside my room grew louder with visitors, families coming and going, voices rising in comfort or grief, footsteps echoing against tile, floors, and with each door opening down the hall I hoped it was him, hoped he had finally seen the missed calls, hoped he had shaken off her influence long enough to come, hoping that somewhere inside him the old bond we shared would push him toward me, but the door never opened for him, not the entire day. And when the nurse came back in the afternoon, she asked if I wanted her to try again, and I nodded, trying to hide the fear rising in my throat, and she stepped out, phone in hand, leaving the door slightly cracked, and I heard her conversation muffled, but I understood enough. She had to leave another message. She had not reached a person. She had not reached him, and the ache in my chest wasn't medical. Then it was emotional, heavy, sharp, growing in ways no machine could measure, because the little boy who once ran to me barefoot through the yard now couldn't pick up a phone because someone else stood between us deciding what he should care about. And I remembered how she always rolled her eyes when he mentioned me, how she called my house old-fashioned, how she said spending time with me was a burden, how she once said in a voice dripping with impatience that young people shouldn't have to revolve their lives around the elderly, and he had laughed awkwardly, trying to smooth it over, not seeing how that kind of thinking slowly erodes love, how it convinces someone that loyalty is optional, how it plants the idea that caring for family is outdated and inconvenient, and lying there with machines tracking every beat of my heart. I wondered if he would blame himself when he learned where I was, if he would realize he hadn't just missed a casual call, if he would realize the distance she created came at a price far higher than either of them imagined. And as the hours faded into evening, the room grew. Dim lights humming softly, and a different nurse came in to check my vitals. She asked if anyone had visited yet, and when I shook my head, she gave me a look filled with pity, the kind that stings because it holds truth. And she said gently, "Sometimes family takes time to process emergencies," but I could hear what she didn't say, the part she swallowed because it wasn't her place, the part that asked, why didn't they come? And I lay there wondering the same question, replaying the moments that led to this, the unanswered calls, the silence, the voice dismissing my plea, the laughter echoing behind her when she refused to hand him the phone, and somewhere deep inside, a concern began to grow, not just for myself but for him, because if she could ignore someone fighting for their life without flinching, what else could she pull him into? What else could she convince him to overlook? What else could she make him sacrifice in the name of keeping her happy? And the weight of that thought pressed down harder than any physical pain, because this wasn't just a medical crisis. This was the moment I finally understood that she wasn't just thoughtless, she was dangerous, not with violence, but with indifference, with neglect, with selfishness, sharp enough to cut through bonds that had taken decades to build. And I knew then, lying in that sterile quiet, that the danger she posed to him wasn't something time would fix, it was something that would eventually destroy him if no one intervened. And as the monitor beeped in steady rhythm, I realized this wasn't just a battle for my life, it was becoming a battle for his too, even if he didn't know it yet. The next morning in the hospital felt like waking inside someone else's body, the stiffness, the weight, the cold hum of machines, measuring the parts of me that felt too fragile to trust, and I blinked slowly, trying to understand whether the night had passed quietly or whether the darkness had swallowed pieces of time I could no longer account for. And when the nurse came in, she spoke softly, asking if I had slept, asking if the pain had eased, asking if I wanted breakfast. But my mind wasn't on my body. It was on the quiet beside me, the still untouched chair, the absence that had burrowed so deep into my chest. It throbbed alongside the physical ache, and she told me again that she had left a second. The message told me she still hadn't reached him, told me she would keep trying, and I nodded, though every word felt like pressing on a bruise. And when she stepped out, I stared at the blank wall across from me, imagining him holding his phone, imagining him seeing the missed calls, imagining him feeling something shift inside him, enough to make him reach out. But I also imagined her beside him, imagined her hand sliding over his, imagined her telling him it wasn't important, imagined her calling it drama, imagined her smiling that cold, small smile she saved for moments when empathy was needed, but never offered. And I tried not to think that, but the thoughts came anyway because I remembered too clearly the way she dismissed my voice, the way she shut down my plea, the way she laughed in the background while I struggled to breathe, and that memory burned heavier than any fever could. And somewhere near midday, a doctor entered the room, holding a chart, speaking in that calm, controlled tone meant to soften harsh truths, and she told me my condition had been worse than they expected, told me it was good. I didn't wait any longer, told me another hour might have changed everything, and I swallowed slowly, feeling the weight of what almost happened, settling against my ribs. But beneath the medical facts, beneath the gratitude for being alive, there was something else growing sharper, a thought I didn't want but couldn't silence, the knowledge that while I clung to consciousness, someone was clinging to a cocktail glass, laughing, posing for photographs, telling the world how much fun she was having, and the hours crept by the light, shifting through the window in long, slow strokes, and with each passing, the chair beside my bed remained empty, and nurses rotated in and out, checking machines, adjusting blankets, offering comfort I had no words for. And at one point a younger nurse lingered a moment longer than usual, glancing toward the door before asking gently, "Is there someone coming?" And I wanted to say, "Yes, he will come. He always comes. He has always come, since he was little, since he used to run through my front door with scraped knees and bright stories. He will come. He must come." But the words stuck like stones in my throat because the truth kept pressing harder against my heart. He might not know. He might think I'm sleeping. He might think I'm fine. He might think I didn't call. He might think everything is normal. And the reason he might think those things had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the silence she had placed between us. And the nurse gave me a look lined with sympathy and something like disappointment, not at me but at whoever belonged in that empty chair. And when she stepped out, the room felt larger, emptier, quieter, and I tried not to imagine him smiling. In photos he didn't know were cruel. I tried not to imagine her posting images of champagne while my monitors beeped warning signs, but the images came anyway, uninvited, unforgiving. And the thought that she had heard my voice cracking in pain, heard me say something was wrong, heard me struggle to breathe, and still chose a party over a life cut deeper than any physical wound. And I wondered if he would see those posts, wondered if he would scroll past her, glittering images, unaware that each one was taken while I was fighting to stay conscious. And that thought alone made my stomach twist, because I knew him. I knew his heart. I knew if he discovered that truth, it would destroy something inside him, something he might never fully repair. And evening settled slowly, the hallway lights dimming into that soft hospital glow, and I drifted in and out, unsure whether hours or minutes passed, until the door opened again, and the nurse stepped in, holding a small device in her hand, and said she had checked again, said there was still no answer, said she would try tomorrow, and her voice gentled at the last word, as if she knew how much it hurt. And when she left, I let my head fall back slowly, breathing through the pressure building behind my eyes, because I wasn't angry at him, I wasn't disappointed in him, I wasn't blaming him. The ache inside me wasn't his fault. It was hers, all hers, the neglect, the dismissal, the coldness, the manipulation, the way she kept him insulated from the people who loved him, the way she fed him, the idea that caring for family was optional, the way she rewrote his priorities until loyalty felt like inconvenience. And I remembered the moment she first entered his life, the sharp glint in her eyes that I dismissed as nerves, the way she smiled too sweetly when she wanted something, the way she turned distant the second she no longer needed to impress, and the more I remembered, the more painful the truth became. She wasn't simply careless, she was calculated. She had always been. And now lying in this room with machines reminding me of how close I came to disappearing. Finally understood the pattern. Every ignored message, every delayed visit, every excuse she whispered into his ear, and I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion pull at me, letting the fear settle under my skin, because I couldn't stop the next thought from rising. If she could ignore my voice while I was fighting for my life, she could ignore anything she could, silence anyone. She could isolate him until he had no one left to turn to but her. And that was what scared me more than anything. Not that she ignored me, not that she partied while I struggled, but that she might guide him into a deeper darkness, a place where he would lose more than time, he would lose himself. And as the night wrapped around the hospital and my body drifted somewhere between pain and sleep, a single truth clung to me like a lifeline. He needed to know what happened. He needed to hear the truth from me before she twisted it into something else. And I prayed quietly into the dim room that I would have the chance to tell him, that I would have the strength to stand once more in front of him, that I would not leave this world with him believing I didn't reach for him, because even as my life trembled on the edge, he was the first person I called, and I needed him to know that. The day I was finally strong enough to sit upright, without the room tilting, felt like stepping into a world that had kept moving without me. And I asked the nurse again whether anyone had called back, whether there had been a message, whether he had asked about me, and she shook her head softly, the way people do when they wish they had a different answer, and something inside my chest tightened with a deeper kind of ache, the kind that doesn't belong to the body but to the heart. And I told myself not to panic, told myself he might still be asleep, he might still be working, he might not have seen the missed calls. But something colder whispered the truth she hadn't told him. She hadn't let him hear. She had chosen for him again. And the longer I sat in that hospital bed, the clearer the pattern became, and I pushed myself up slowly, holding onto the side rail, because I knew I needed to see him, needed to tell him. Everything needed him to hear my voice directly, without it being filtered through her indifference. But when the nurse offered to arrange a wheelchair to take me outside for a moment, I realized I wasn't ready. Not yet, not physically, not emotionally, not until I had the strength to stand on my own, 2 legs in front of him, and say what needed to be said. And the hours passed in long, quiet stretches, beeping machines, filling the room with the reminder that I was still alive, still here, still fighting. And I tried to rest, but my mind kept circling the same image again and again, him smiling in photos he didn't know were taken while I lay on a stretcher gasping for breath, and her posting them with captions drenched in neon joy, as if nothing existed outside her own reflection. And when evening came and the sky outside my window shifted into a deep, warm orange, the nurse told me gently that I might be able to go home the next day if my heart stabilized, and the relief that washed over me wasn't for my health, but for the chance to finally look my grandson in the eyes and give him the truth he, Vela, deserved. And when night fell, the hospital grew quieter, shadows stretching across the walls, soft footsteps echoing in the hallways, and I drifted in and out of sleep until somewhere deep in the dark I heard the faint vibration of a phone coming from the nurse's station, and moments later soft footsteps approached my door, and the night nurse peeked in with a small smile, saying someone was at the front desk asking about me, and my chest tightened, hope rising so quickly it almost hurt, because I thought it was him, thought he had finally seen the calls, thought he had broken through whatever silence she wrapped around him. But when the nurse stepped aside, the person who walked in wasn't him. It was my neighbor, the one who checked on me, sometimes the one who noticed my mail piling up, the one who had seen the ambulance lights and grown worried. And she told me she had tried calling but no one answered, and she came in person when the worry became too loud to ignore, and the gratitude that filled me then almost brought tears to my eyes, because she was not blood, she was not family, she was not tied to me by anything but human decency and kindness, and she still showed up, still asked, still cared. And as she sat beside me telling me she would drive me home when I was ready, telling me she had fed my brotties, cats telling me she had watered my plants. Something inside me began to thaw, but the thaw hurt because it reminded me of who wasn't there, who should have been, who would have been, if not for the quiet wall someone else had built around his loyalty. And when she left, I lay awake, unable to sleep, unable to shake the thought that maybe she would never tell him. Maybe he would never know, maybe he would go through life believing I just stopped calling, stopped needing him, stopped loving him, and that thought tore at me worse than any needle or machine. And the next morning the doctor came in saying my vitals had improved, saying I could go home. If someone drove me, and true to her word, my neighbor appeared with a warm coat and steady arms, helping me walk slowly through the halls, and the sunlight outside felt too bright after days of fluorescent bulbs, and the cold air bit into my lungs, but it felt like waking up for the first time since everything happened. And when we reached my house, she guided me inside, helped me settle on the couch, made sure I had food, made sure I had water, told me to call her if I needed anything. And when the door closed behind her, the house felt quiet in a different way. Not heavy, not suffocating, but waiting. Waiting for the moment I would gather enough strength to make the call I had been holding inside. With trembling fingers, I dialed his number again, and this time it rang longer than before, long enough to spark a flicker of hope before it clicked into voicemail. I stared at the phone, listening to the hollow recording of his voice, and something inside me cracked, and I tried again and again, each unanswered ring digging deeper into the truth that maybe she still held his phone, maybe she still filtered his world, maybe she still decided what he saw and didn't see. And I whispered into the voicemail, even though I knew she might delete it, whispered that I loved him, that I was home, that I needed to see him. And the silence that followed once the message ended felt heavier than anything the hospital had held, and I set the phone down, gripping the armrest, breathing slowly because panic wasn't going to help. Panic wasn't going to make him answer. Panic wasn't going to undo everything she had woven around him. And when the sun dipped low and the house dimmed, I heard the soft ding of a notification, and my heart jumped. But when I reached for the phone, it wasn't a call from him. It was a photo, her posted publicly, a picture of them at another event, smiling, framed in soft lights, drinks raised, her makeup flawless, his smile wide, but forced in a way only someone who truly knew him would notice, and the caption was loud and hollow: another perfect night with my love, surrounded by joy and laughter. And I felt my breath hitch, not from jealousy, not from bitterness, but from the raw ache of knowing that while I fought to stay alive, he was standing beneath flashing lights, thinking the world was whole, thinking everything was normal, thinking I was safe, because she let him think that. And that was the moment something hardened inside me, something steady, something old. I would not leave him in the dark. I would not let her silence him from the truth. I would not let the distance she built become permanent. And as the last light faded from the sky, I made a decision with a clarity that felt almost painful. I would find a way to reach him directly, to stand in front of him, to speak the truth she tried so hard to bury, because he needed to know what happened. He needed to know who ignored it. He needed to know how close he came to losing me, and how easy it was for her to look away while I fought for my life. The morning I finally gathered the strength to stand without the room spinning felt like a second chance I wasn't sure I deserved, and I made myself breathe slow, steady breaths as I walked from the living room to the kitchen, trying to ground myself in the simple reality of being alive. Because, for days, everything felt like it existed behind a thin veil, and now the world felt sharper, brighter, almost too real, and I knew what I had to do before fear convinced me otherwise. And I reached for my coat, hands trembling not from weakness anymore, but from the weight of what I was about to confront, because this wasn't just a visit. This wasn't a casual check-in. This was the moment I would look my grandson in the eyes and tell him the truth, no matter who stood beside him, no matter how she glared, no matter what narrative she tried to twist. And as I stepped outside, the cold air hit my lungs, like a reminder that time moves with or without us, and I made my way down the street slowly, each step heavy but determined. And when I reached his house, I hesitated for only a moment before knocking, heart pounding louder than the echoes, and I waited, listening for footsteps, hoping he would answer, hoping she wasn't the one to open the door, because I wasn't sure whether my heart could handle seeing her face before I said what needed to be said. And after a few Seconds. The handle turned and the door opened, and there he stood, looking tired, eyes slightly dark around the edges, hair uncombed like he hadn't slept well. And when he saw me, something flickered across his face, confusion, surprise, guilt, and something softer buried beneath all of it. And he stepped aside instantly, letting me in, his voice cracking just a little. When he said he thought I was resting, he thought everything was fine. He thought I was home, taking it easy because she never told him anything else, and I stood there in the 5 entryway, breathing slowly, because the truth was about to split, his world open, and I didn't want to break him. But I couldn't protect him from this either, and before I could speak, she walked out from the hallway, hair perfect, makeup perfect, smile forced, barely covering the irritation in her eyes, when she saw me standing there, and I watched her body tense, watched her look at him, then at me, calculating the fastest way to take control of the moment, before he heard something she didn't script for him. And she stepped forward with that practiced gentleness, asking if I was feeling better, if I needed anything, if I wanted to sit, and the way she spoke made my skin crawl, because I heard the lie beneath every syllable, and my grandson looked between us, lost already, sensing something was wrong, and finally I told him the truth, slowly, clearly, without dramatics, without anger, because truth doesn't need embellishment, and his expression began to change with every word I spoke. The ambulance, the unanswered calls, the pain, the operator, the hospital, the messages, the silence, the way she hung up on me, the way she told me he didn't have time, the way she deleted every trace of my voice from his phone, the way she partied while I lay hooked to machines. And when I said those last words, his knees buckled slightly, and he had to sit down, and she stepped forward quickly, trying to interrupt, trying to laugh it off, trying to say, I must be confused, trying to say I exaggerated, trying to say I was tired, trying to say I misremembered, but he held up his hand, stopping her, and his whole body trembled, because he wasn't confused anymore, because the truth was landing sharper than any lie she ever fed him, and he asked her one question, his voice so quiet it almost broke me. Did you tell me? She called, and she hesitated not long, only a second, but enough for him to see everything, enough for the world he built around her to crumble, enough for the fog she wrapped around him to begin slipping, and she started speaking fast. Excuses, 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 all of them thin, all of them collapsing before they even reached the air, and he looked at me, then looked at her, and something inside him cracked, not loudly, not violently, but with the quiet finality of a bridge giving way after too much strain, and he asked her again more firmly, this time, did you tell me she needed help? And she looked away, and the silence that followed felt like the entire house was holding its breath, and my grandson's face twisted with something, jagged, grief, betrayal, disbelief, and he whispered, you let me smile in pictures, you let me laugh in bars, you let me celebrate, while she was in a hospital fighting for her life. And her face tightened, her voice rising, accusing me of trying to ruin things, accusing me of making him choose, accusing me of turning him against her, accusing me of lying to manipulate him. And he stood up slowly, shaking from the inside out, and told her to stop. And the tone in his voice was one I had never heard from him, not anger, not hatred, but shock, pure shock that someone he trusted, someone he loved, someone he defended, had been capable of such coldness. And she tried to touch him, tried to pull him back into the script, tried to cry, tried to force softness into her voice, but he stepped away from her, the first clear break in the pattern she had built around him, and he looked at her with eyes full of something hollow and said the words she never expected. You didn't protect me, you isolated me. And she tried to argue, but he didn't let her, and he kept shaking his head, whispering, how could you? How could you? How could you? And she turned to me, desperate, wild, asking me to stop, to take it back, to tell him he misunderstood. But I stayed silent because truth doesn't bend. And finally he told her to leave, told her he needed space, told her he needed time, told her he needed distance, told her he needed air. And she stared at him, stunned, because she had never imagined losing control of him. Not like this, not so quickly, not so completely. And she walked out with a look on her face that wasn't heartbreak, but fury. The fury of someone losing a grip they thought was unbreakable, and the door closed behind her with a sound that felt like a whole chapter ending, and the moment she was gone, he collapsed onto the couch, hands over his face, body trembling with sobs. He tried to hold back, and I sat beside him, not touching him, just being there because he needed space to crumble and rebuild without pressure, and he kept whispering, "I'm sorry. I didn't know I should have been there. I didn't know. I trusted her. I didn't know." And I told him, softly, that the fault wasn't his, that manipulation doesn't look like manipulation when you're living inside it, that he didn't abandon me, he was kept away from me, and he cried harder. Then the kind of grief that breaks open when the truth finally reveals how much you've been robbed of, and when the tears slowed, he leaned back, breathing unevenly, and whispered, "I could have lost you," and those words hit me deeper than anything, because now he finally understood the cost, the danger, the distance that nearly cost us everything. And we sat in the quiet of that living room, both of us exhausted, both of us changed, and when he finally reached for my hand, it wasn't out of guilt or fear or obligation, it was out of something he thought he had lost, but was rediscovering: tenderness, love, clarity, and a bond, stronger than anything she tried to sever. And as I looked at him, tears still wet on his face, I realized something. The storm that nearly took my life had also broken the hold she had on him, and now he could finally see clearly, finally breathe freely, finally choose for himself. And that truth was enough to carry me through the memory of sirens, enough to soften the ache in my chest, enough to remind me that even after everything, some things can still be rebuilt if given the chance.